Hi, welcome to our channel where we tell the most exciting stories. An incredible story awaits you today. If you have ever encountered neighbors who are sure they know how to live, then this story is for you. What should I do if someone tries to control your property? In this case, it all started with a simple visit, but turned into a real confrontation. How did a quiet farm become the center of a neighborhood scandal? And how did it end? I never imagined I'd be standing at the crossroads of tradition and modern intrusion, but life in the quiet valley of Gracefield has a way of throwing unexpected challenges your way. My name is Eleanor Harper, a 67-year-old widow with silver-streaked hair, a heart full of memories, and a lifetime's worth of stories etched into the walls of my family's farmhouse. This isn't just any house. It's the Harper family farm, built by my grandfather over a century ago. Nestled in the rolling hills, our little patch of land has always been my sanctuary, a place where the hum of tractors, the cluck of hens, and the rustle of wind in the trees drown out the noise of the world. For decades, this farm has been more than just home. It's been the beating heart of my family, the ground where my husband and I raised our 2 children and countless crops. Even after his passing 10 years ago, the farm's rhythm gave me purpose and solace. These days, I share this home with my 24-year-old grandson, Max. Fresh out of university with a degree in agroecology, Max came to stay with me while navigating the tricky transition into the working world. Max is a dreamer, much like his late grandfather was. He has big ideas about sustainable farming, crop rotation, and soil health, concepts I only vaguely understand but admire nonetheless. He's turned a corner of the barn into a makeshift lab, where jars of soil samples and rows of seedlings sit alongside dusty old tools and broken tractor parts. His energy fills the house with life, and though he's still finding his footing, I can see his passion will lead him somewhere extraordinary. Our days on the farm are simple but fulfilling. Mornings start early with the crow of a rooster, and evenings are punctuated by the golden glow of the setting sun over the fields. We spend weekends fixing fences, planting seeds, and tending to the small orchard my husband planted years ago. It's a life that keeps you grounded, connected to the earth, the seasons, and your own resilience. But lately, the peace of Gracefield has been disturbed. About 2 years ago, developers broke ground on an upscale neighborhood just a few miles down the road. They called it River Bridge, a gated community with pristine lawns, winding streets, and identical mansions packed close together like a row of dominoes. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the construction. After all, the farm has always felt like its own little universe, untouched by the outside world. Riverbridge, however, wasn't just another neighborhood. It came with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own queen, Karen. Karen is a woman who seems to have stepped straight out of a magazine cover for suburban superiority. In her early 50s, she's the type who wears perfectly tailored blazers to grocery shop and treats her oversized SUV like a badge of honor. I first met her 6 months ago at a charity bake sale held at the local church. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, quickly launching into a monologue about her position as president of the Riverbridge Homeowners Association. "It's important to maintain standards," she'd said, adjusting the collar of her cashmere sweater. "After all, a community is only as strong as its rules." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Her world and mine seemed so different. I had fields to plow and tomatoes to can, while she, apparently, had meetings to run and bylaws to enforce. It wasn't until Riverbridge's shiny white picket fences began creeping closer to the edge of my property that I realized how much our lives were about to collide. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. It arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope with a Riverbridge HOA seal stamped on the front. Inside was a politely worded reminder about keeping up with community standards, including lawn maintenance and architectural guidelines. I chuckled at the absurdity of it. Surely they didn't mean to include me. My farmhouse was miles from their gates, separated by acres of untamed meadow and a winding gravel road. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the fireplace, dismissing it as a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake, not according to Karen. A few weeks later, she appeared on my doorstep, clipboard in hand, and an air of authority that could have intimidated someone less stubborn. She pointed out the unsightly wildflowers lining my driveway and suggested that I install a more cohesive fence to match the aesthetic of Riverbridge. I reminded her as politely as I could that my farm had existed long before Riverbridge and that I had no intention of changing anything. Karen didn't take kindly to my response. "Mrs. Harper," she said with a saccharine smile, "I'm sure you understand how important it is to protect property values. As a neighbor, I'm only here to help you align with our vision for the community." Her words were honeyed, but her tone was steel. It was clear this was no friendly suggestion. It was a warning. Since that day, the tension between us has only grown. Karen has made it her mission to keep an eagle eye on the farm, and her visits have become increasingly frequent. It was a crisp, clear morning when the knock came at my door. The sun was just climbing over the hills, casting a warm glow across the fields, and I'd been elbow deep in preparing dough for the day's baking. Max was out back tinkering with the tractor, trying to coax life into the old beast before the next planting season. It was a peaceful, ordinary start to the day, until I opened the door to find Karen standing there, her usual air of self-importance practically radiating off her. She was dressed sharply as if ready to chair a board meeting, her tailored blazer and pearl earrings out of place against the rustic backdrop of my farmhouse. In her hand was a leather-bound folder clasped tightly as if it held the fate of the world, or at least her version of it. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the porch as if she were assessing its compliance with some unseen standard. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," she began, her tone laced with an edge of condescension. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important, but we need to discuss a matter of community concern." I wiped my hands on my apron, already bracing myself. "Good morning, Karen. What can I do for you?" She didn't waste any time. Opening her folder, she pulled out a sheaf of papers and began listing her grievances. According to her, Max's late-night study sessions with his friends, completely innocent, mind you, were a disruption to the peace and harmony of the neighborhood. She claimed the sound of his tractor, even during the daytime, was jarring to the aesthetic of Riverbridge. And, as she so delicately put it, certain neighbors had raised concerns about the effect this activity might have on property values. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Karen, with all due respect, this is a working farm. It's been a working farm for generations, long before Riverbridge was even a thought." Her smile tightened, and she tilted her head as if addressing a stubborn child. "Mrs. Harper, I understand your perspective, but Riverbridge is a unified community, and we all need to adhere to the same standards. It's in everyone's best interest." I crossed my arms, feeling my patience wearing thin. "Karen, my farm is not part of Riverbridge. Your HOA rules don't apply here." That seemed to set her off balance for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Actually," she said, her voice growing firmer, "our regulations extend to any property bordering the community. It's in our bylaws. I have them right here if you'd like to take a look." She held the papers out to me, but I didn't reach for them. Instead, I met her gaze steadily. "Karen, I've read my property deeds. My land was established decades before Riverbridge existed. It's not subject to your rules, and it never will be." Her expression faltered, but only briefly. "Be that as it may," she said, her tone now dripping with forced sweetness. "I strongly encourage you to reconsider. We all want the best for this area, and working together would make things so much easier for everyone." I could feel my blood starting to simmer, but I kept my voice calm. "Karen, I appreciate your concerns, but my farm is my business. If you have any other issues, I suggest you take them up with someone else." She stood there for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to push further. Finally, she snapped her folder shut. "Very well, Mrs. Harper, but I'll remind you that the HOA is committed to maintaining the standards of our community. I'll be keeping an eye on things." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, her heels clicking against the gravel. I watched her go, shaking my head in disbelief. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed Karen's visit were anything but peaceful. She launched what can only be described as a campaign against my farm, each move more audacious than the last. It started small, a note left in my mailbox with a reminder about community standards and a suggestion to improve the farm's curb appeal. I crumpled it up without a second thought, but Karen wasn't content to stop there. The first real blow came when I noticed a county inspector pulling into my driveway one morning. The man stepped out of his car, clipboard in hand, and informed me that he was there to investigate a report of possible sanitary violations on the property. Apparently, someone had claimed that my farm posed a health hazard to the surrounding community. I knew exactly who someone was. After a thorough inspection of the barn, the chicken coop, and the compost piles, the inspector found nothing out of order. He even complimented me on the cleanliness of my operations, but the seed of suspicion had already been planted. I saw a few of the Riverbridge residents peering over their fences as he drove away, their curiosity tinged with unease. It wasn't long before the rumors started. According to Karen, the farm wasn't just a nuisance, it was a haven for illegal activities. Whispers spread that Max and his friends were up to no good, their late-night study sessions twisted into something far more sinister. The result was a noticeable shift in the neighborhood dynamic. People who had once waved as they passed now avoided eye contact. At the market, familiar faces turned away, unwilling to engage in even casual conversation. The final straw came when I caught wind of a meeting Karen had held with the Riverbridge HOA. She proposed what she called a community intervention, suggesting that the HOA take matters into their own hands to bring the farm up to standard. The sheer audacity of her plan left me seething. How could she think she had the right to dictate what happened on land that wasn't even hers? Max, seeing the growing tension, blamed himself. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, his face heavy with guilt. "Grandma," he said softly, "maybe I should move out. I don't want to cause you more trouble." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "This is your home as much as it is mine. Karen doesn't get to decide how we live our lives." That night, as I sat by the fireplace, I knew it was time to act. Karen's antics had gone too far, and if she thought I was going to let her push me off my own land, she was sorely mistaken. It was time to draw the line. Enough was enough. Karen's relentless meddling had to stop, and I knew I couldn't fight her alone. That's when I called Jason Black, an old friend and retired attorney who had made a career out of defending small-town folks from big city bullies. Jason was the kind of man who could dissect a contract faster than you could blink, and his no-nonsense demeanor made him the perfect ally. When I explained the situation, Jason wasted no time. "Eleanor," he said, sipping his coffee as we sat at my kitchen table, "the law is on your side, but we're going to need more than just your word to put Karen in her place." Over the next week, Jason and I dove into the stacks of paperwork I'd kept stored in the attic for years. Deeds, surveys, tax records, everything that proved my farm had no legal ties to Riverbridge. Among the documents, we even found the original property map, drafted in my grandfather's time, with boundaries clearly marked far from any HOA jurisdiction. But Jason didn't stop there. "Karen's probably done this before," he said with a sharp gleam in his eye. Together, we reached out to other farmers and residents in the area. Sure enough, we found several who had been harassed by Karen's HOA. Their stories varied. One had been pressured to tear down an old barn, while another was accused of running an unauthorized event space simply for hosting a family reunion. Each testimony painted a picture of Karen's overreach, and they were more than willing to back me up. With Jason's help, we drafted a cease and desist letter that was as thorough as it was intimidating. The letter outlined every instance of Karen's harassment, backed by legal precedent, and warned of severe consequences if her behavior continued. It wasn't just a warning, it was a statement that I wasn't going to back down. The final step was a face-to-face confrontation. Jason insisted I bring Max for moral support, and together we marched up to Karen's door. She answered, her ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm, and her usual air of superiority faltered for just a moment when she saw us. "Karen," I began, keeping my voice steady, "we need to talk." We weren't alone. Several members of the HOA were gathered in her living room, likely for one of her infamous meetings. Jason stepped forward and placed the letter on her coffee table. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said in a tone that left no room for argument, "this document outlines the boundaries of Eleanor's property and proves beyond any doubt that your HOA has no authority here." Karen tried to interrupt, her voice dripping with indignation. "This doesn't change the fact that—" Jason held up a hand. "It changes everything. Eleanor's land predates Riverbridge by decades. Your bylaws don't apply, and your continued interference constitutes harassment. If you don't stop, we'll pursue legal action." I pulled out the original property map and laid it before her. "This farm was built by my grandfather," I said, my voice firm. "These documents are as clear as day. Your rules don't apply here, Karen, and if you keep spreading lies about my family, I'll take you to court for defamation." Karen's face reddened, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. She glanced at the HOA members who were exchanging uneasy glances, clearly less eager to back her now that the facts were laid bare. "You can't expect us to ignore the state of your property," Karen finally snapped, though her voice wavered. "This is about community standards." Jason leaned forward, his tone icy. "Karen, this isn't about community standards. This is about you overstepping your authority. Either you respect the law or we'll see you in court." Karen fell silent, her hands gripping the edge of her clipboard as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The room felt heavy with the weight of the truth she could no longer deny. Finally, she muttered something about reviewing the documents and ushered us out. As we left, I glanced at Max, whose face was a mixture of pride and relief. "Grandma," he said quietly, "you're incredible." I smiled. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, but deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The fallout from our confrontation with Karen didn't take long to ripple through Riverbridge. Word spread quickly about the evidence Jason and I had presented, and Karen found herself facing scrutiny from the very people she'd once controlled with her iron grip. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and though I wasn't technically part of their community, I was invited to attend as a guest, along with Max. The meeting was tense, to say the least. Karen, always so poised, looked noticeably frazzled as she stood at the front of the room. Her usual confidence was replaced with a nervous edge, and for the first time she seemed to realize just how precarious her position had become. One by one, the neighbors voiced their frustrations, not just about her overreach with my farm, but about years of petty rules and unjust fines. It was clear the tide had turned against her. Finally, with the weight of the room bearing down on her, Karen did what I never thought I'd see. She apologized. Her words were stiff, and her pride was still painfully evident, but she admitted to her mistakes. "I overstepped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I acted without considering the impact on others. To Mrs. Harper, her grandson, and to all of you, I'm sorry." The room was quiet for a moment, and though the apology felt begrudging, it was enough to begin the process of repair. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, their demeanor entirely different from the cold avoidance I'd experienced weeks before. They expressed admiration for my resolve and offered apologies of their own for believing Karen's lies. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Tom, shook my hand firmly. "You stood up for yourself, and for what's right," he said. "That's not easy to do. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." From that day forward, the dynamic between the farm and Riverbridge began to shift. People who had once avoided eye contact now waved and smiled as they passed. A few even stopped by to ask about Max's agroecology projects, their curiosity replacing the suspicion Karen had sown. While Karen herself retreated from the spotlight, the community's respect for her authority had eroded completely. For the first time, I felt like the farm wasn't just on the edge of the neighborhood. It was part of it, in the best way possible. Life began to settle into a new rhythm after the dust of the conflict with Karen finally cleared. The once tense relationship with the Riverbridge community transformed into something far more positive. What had started as a battle for independence became the foundation for connection, and it wasn't long before the farm became more than just a home. It became a gathering place. One day, Max came rushing into the kitchen, his face alight with excitement. "Grandma," he exclaimed, barely able to contain himself. "You won't believe this. Tom from Riverbridge put in a good word for me with his brother-in-law. I've got an interview for a sustainable farming internship." The opportunity turned out to be a perfect fit. The local company was involved in agroecological projects that aligned with everything Max was passionate about. Within weeks, he had secured the internship, and I watched as he threw himself into the work with the same energy and enthusiasm he'd brought to the farm. It was a joy to see him thriving. Meanwhile, the farm itself found a new purpose. Inspired by the connections we'd made, I decided to open the gates to the community. What started as a simple idea, a weekend farmer's market, quickly grew into something much larger. Neighbors from Riverbridge and beyond came together to sell handmade goods, share produce, and enjoy live music under the old oak tree. The events became a monthly tradition, and the farm buzzed with laughter, conversation, and a renewed sense of belonging. One evening, after the last of the market stalls had been packed away, I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills. The farmhouse glowed with the warmth of lantern light, and I could still hear the faint hum of voices as the last guests made their way home. Max joined me, a cup of tea in his hand, and we sat in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke. "You know, Grandma," he said, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood your ground. You didn't just protect the farm, you brought people together." I smiled, reflecting on his words. It hadn't been easy to stand firm against Karen and her HOA, but it had been worth it, not just for the farm, but for the people it now connected. "Sometimes," I said softly, "you have to fight for what's right, but you don't have to lose your humanity doing it. That's how you truly make a difference." As the stars began to dot the sky, I thought about the stories that had begun to circulate around town, tales of the Harper Farms battle against Riverbridge. Some were exaggerated, no doubt, but the heart of it remained true. It was a story about standing firm, finding common ground, and creating something better in the process. And as I looked out over the land that had seen generations of Harpers grow and thrive, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing it would continue to do so for many years to come. Did you like the story? Do you want more of these exciting stories with unexpected twists? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.